Okay, I'm going to start recording now, and I'm going to share my slides for this. There they are. And now I'm going to get rid of this. And I'm going to start the show. Okay, excellent. So welcome now to week 11, meeting 2, part 2 of this recorded lecture while I'm away at the conference in Mobile. And the topic of this part 2 is to relate to you some persistent problems for AI that plagued AI from the very beginning and continue to be problems up to today. And then I want to introduce John Searle's criticism of cognitivism based on how we human beings follow rules as contrasted with the way that computers follow rules. So that's where we're headed on part 2. Now let's start with some persistent problems that persist to today for artificial intelligence. I want to begin with a problem that was first introduced in the early 1980s, back when AI was just getting started, by philosopher Keith Gunderson. Now, I had the opportunity to work. Keith passed away about a decade ago. I had the opportunity to work with Keith. He visited Irvine when I was a graduate student there for a semester and ran a seminar on artificial intelligence. And I got a chance to meet with him. And this was back in the mid 1980s. And one of the arguments he presented at this was the argument I'm about to give you today. And here's what Gunderson distinguishes. He distinguishes what he calls program receptive versus program resistant tasks. In other words, program receptive tasks are those kinds of tasks that it's relatively easy, conceptually speaking, in order to program a digital computer to do well. Whereas program resistant tasks are the kinds of tasks that it's very difficult to program a digital computer to do well. So program receptive tasks are things like number crunching, theorem proving, list searching. Those are the kinds of things that, you have to be an adept programmer to do anything interesting. But nevertheless, those are problems that are relatively easy to solve in terms of their conceptual difficulty for programmers, though sometimes technically they can be quite difficult to solve. But contrast those with what Gunderson calls program resistant tasks. Facial recognition. We have some pretty good facial recognition around nowadays, but it's not really succeeding by just simply running a program. Scene apprehension, where you present a visual scene to the computer and have it apprehend what's going on in the scene. Sensory motor coordination. We've emphasized that the best chess player in the world is a computer, not a human being. But that's not true about the best tennis player or the best football player or the best acrobat. Those are all human beings. Now, computers are getting better. Robots are getting better at those kinds of tasks, but they still don't even come close to matching human performance. And finally, large-scale learning. That is the kind of learning we call conceptual learning. But here's what Gunderson noticed when he distinguished program receptive versus program resistant tasks. Interestingly, human intelligence is the reverse. Program receptive tasks are human resistant. It's very, very hard for human beings to crunch numbers. Try to multiply a couple of 3-digit numbers in your head, or even on paper for some people, right? Theorem proving, list searching. These are the kind of things that human beings do not do well. But facial recognition, scene apprehension, sensory motor coordination, large-scale learning, if you got an intact nervous system, you're going to be able to do these particular tasks relatively well. So the interesting thing is human intelligence is exactly the reverse of artificial intelligence when it comes to what Gunderson called program receptive, program resistant tasks. Program receptive tasks are human resistant and program resistant tasks are human receptive. What does this suggest to you about how human intelligence and AI relate? Think about it for a minute. Because what it suggested to Gunderson was that natural and artificial intelligence operate on very different principles. The kinds of intelligence that we have just seem to work on very different principles than the kind of intelligence it's relatively easy to program into a machine. Interesting point. Okay, now let me introduce you to a point made by philosopher Dan Dennett in that little first few pages of that short selection, Cognitive Wheels, that I asked you to read for this part of today's lecture. Now, I'm just going to quote you from the beginning of this essay that I asked you to read. It's on the course Canvas site as a PDF. But I'm going to stop at various points and ask you to reflect on some questions. Here's how Dennett starts this famous article. Once upon a time, there was a robot named R1. Its only task was to fend for itself, survive. One day, its designers arranged for it to learn that its spare battery, its precious energy source, was locked in a room with a time bomb set to go off soon. R1 located the room and the key to the door and formulated a plan to remove its battery. There was a wagon in the room and the battery was on the wagon, and R1 hypothesized that a certain action, which it called pull out wagon room, would result in the battery being removed from the room. Straight away it acted and did succeed in getting the battery out of the room. Unfortunately, however, the bomb was also on the wagon. R1 knew that the bomb was on the wagon in the room, but didn't realize that pulling the wagon would bring the bomb out along with the battery. Poor R1 had missed the obvious implication of its planned act. Okay, now with that described, I put to you the question: to overcome this failure, what should R1's programmers program the robot to do next? You've already taught it how to do these simple, locate the battery that it needs, its spare battery, locate the key to the room, pull out wagon room. Unfortunately, you have not taught it that everything else on the wagon is going to come out with the wagon as well with the spare battery. So what do? What do you teach it next? Think about that for a second. And then if you want, come back and try your answer. Because I'm going to tell you what Dennett says next. But if you want to stop the program here and think about it and see what you come up with, give it a try. Here's what Dennett says. Back to the drawing board. The solution is obvious, said the designers. Our next robot must be able to recognize not just the intended implications of its acts, but also the implications about their side effects by deducing these implications from the descriptions it uses in formulating its plan. They call their next model, the robot deducer, or R1D1. They placed R1D1 in much the same predicament that R1 had succumbed to, and it too hit upon the idea of pull out wagon room. It began, as designed, to consider the implications of such a course of action. It had just finished deducing that pulling the wagon out of the room would not change the color of the room's walls, and was embarking on a proof of the further implication that pulling the wagon out would cause its wheels to turn more revolutions than there were wheels on the wagon when the bomb exploded. Okay, to overcome this new failure, what should R1D1 programmers do to improve its performance next? You've taught it how to deduce the implications, not only the intended implications, but the side implications of its actions. But that alone didn't solve the problem of getting the wagon out of the room without getting the bomb out of the room, because it just simply sat there and spun off implication after implication, most of them totally irrelevant to the task at hand. So what do you do next? What do you as a programmer R1D1 to do next? If you want to stop the tape and think about it on yourself, we'll come back and you can start it again, because I'm going to go with what Dennett says to do next. Back to the drawing board. We must teach it the difference between relevant implications and irrelevant implications, said the designers, and teach it to ignore the irrelevant ones. So they developed the method of tagging implications as either relevant or irrelevant to the project at hand, and installed the method on their next model, the robot relevant deducer, R2D1 for short. When they subjected R2D1 to the test that had so unequivocally selected its ancestors for extinction, they were surprised to see it sitting, Hamlet-like, outside the room containing the ticking bomb. Do something, they yelled at it. I am, it retorted. I'm busy ignoring some thousands of implications I have determined to be irrelevant. Just as soon as I find an irrelevant implication, I put it on the list of those I must ignore, and the bomb went off. Any suggestions about what the programmers should try next in order to get this their machine to solve this particular problem? If you do, if you have any good ones, the AI research community will pay you enormous amounts of money for them, because this problem remains alive even with our best machines, our most intelligent machines today. Here's what Dennett says about this particular problem. All these robots suffer from the frame problem. If there is ever to be a robot with the fabled perspicuity and all real-time adroitness of R2-D2 in the Star Wars franchise, robot designers must solve the frame problem. One utterly central, if not defining feature of intelligent behavior, this is Den again, is that it can look before it leaps. Better, it can think before it leaps. Intelligence is, at least partly, a matter of using well what you know. But for what? For improving the fidelity of your expectations about what is going to happen next, for planning, for considering courses of action, for framing further hypotheses with the aim of increasing the knowledge you will use in the future so that you can preserve yourself by letting your hypotheses die in your stead. Quote, the stupid, as opposed to the ignorant being, is the one who lights the match to peer into the fuel tank, who saws off the limb he is sitting on, who locks his keys in his car, and then spends the next hour wondering how on earth to get his family out of the car. Those are people that know, they got plenty of knowledge about the world, but they cannot put it together into a coherent piece of action. But when we think before we leap, Dennett continues, how do we do it? Dennett, that's the frame problem of AI. It's easy to make a machine less ignorant. Just give it a bigger memory and a bigger database of facts. That's simple, okay? But how do we make a machine that isn't stupid, okay? That can put those facts to use intelligently in real time and in real circumstances and not make absolutely stupid errors because it failed to reason correctly on the facts it knows. The frame problem and many attempts to solve it have been an ongoing concern and problem in AI since the early days and continue all the way up through IBM's Watson and the more recent ChatGPT and other large language chatbots. As this little funny little computer, this little cartoon demonstrates, Watson in customer service, where it's clearly gotten a question from the customer and it answers, is it plugged in? And you can see its reasoning. It attaches a high probability to user error. It attached a moderate probability to software error, but it even attached the probability to a totally irrelevant answer, Toronto. How do we get it not to do that? How do we get it to focus exclusively on what the relevant problems are in the way that we human beings who are not stupid are capable of doing literally second nature? Watson and ChatGPT and the rest are not ignorant. Both have much of the internet as knowledge base. But getting them not to be stupid is an ongoing project, especially as you give them bigger databases and bigger memories, getting them to focus immediately on the relevant piece of information to solve the problem at hand in the way we humans can do when we're acting intelligently is a ongoing problem in artificial problem. And according to Dennett, that's the frame problem. Okay, now the last thing I want to do to wrap up this section on AI and cognitivism is talk a little bit about John Searle's chapter 3 of Minds, Brains, and Science. Now, I only asked you to browse this chapter because I'm only going to talk about a couple of points in it. But in this chapter, Searle raises a criticism of cognitivism as a methodology for acquiring a scientific understanding of the mind. You remember when we first started talking about AI and cognitive science earlier in this week, I introduced Churchland talking about the methodological problem. What's the best method for going about developing a science of mind? Now, What Searle begins with in chapter 3 is pointing out a perceived gap between mind and brain. And here's what he says at the beginning of chapter 3. Searle, we know perfectly well how to say things like, quote, Basil voted for the Tories because he liked Miss Thatcher's handling of the Falklands affair. That's just good old folk psychology, okay? So that's our common sense conception of mind. Basil voted for the Tories because he liked what Mrs. Thatcher had done. He believed that she did this, and he thought that was a good idea. Now, Searle continues, we don't yet know how to say things like, Basil voted for the Tories because of a condition in his hypothalamus, but we assume that some such neurotalk must be true. And if we keep working toward it, we will find it, but we're not there yet. That is, if you're a physicalist. But which science can fill this gap in our knowledge between folk psychology and developing not yet finished neuroscience? Which science can be the science that's going to be a real science, not folk psychology, but is going to bridge this gap between folk psychology and what we're learning about the brain? And what Searle points out is humanity's latest gap filler, as of now, this late 20th century, was this thing called cognitive science and the concept of information processing as exemplified by what computers do. Searle next gives you an argument on page 45 of chapter 3 that he says convinces many people that cognitivism is the way to go. And here's the way this argument goes. Human beings follow rules when they engage in thinking. That's what thinking's all about, following the rules of logic. And that's what human beings do when they engage in thinking, rational thinking anyway. Computers can be programmed to follow rules in order to process information. So there must be some underlying unitary way, in which both systems, human beings following rules when thinking and computers programmed to follow rules in order to process information, there must be some way in which they're following rules, and when both are following rules in the same way. So by studying information processing in computers, we can find that way. We can bridge the gap between mind and brain. We can use computers and the way they follow rules to process information to tell us about how human beings follow rules when they're thinking. Now, Searle insists that this problem, no matter how intuitive it might seem, and how convincing it seems to many, is seriously flawed. That humans and computers do not follow rules in the same way. And he gives a couple of examples to point out, according to Searle, that with human beings, the actual content, the semantic content, the meaning of the rule, and its linguistic components, determine which rule a human being is following. And he gives us a couple of examples to explain what he's talking about. His first example is this. Now, Searle got his PhD at Oxford before he came back to the States to become a professor at Berkeley. So he constantly was going back and forth to England because he had, collaborators there and former teachers there and all that kind of stuff. And whenever he went back to England, when he was going to drive, he had to remind himself of the rule for driving in England. You're looking at a picture of an English highway, and it probably looks pretty strange to you, right? Because the traffic's on the wrong side of the road. That's because they drive on the opposite side of the road in Britain. And Searle, being an American who goes over there, always had to remind himself of a rule to follow when he was driving in Britain. And the rule that he followed was drive on the left-hand side of the road. Okay, drive on the left hand. Here's your left hand. That's the side of the road that you're supposed to drive on in this particular country. Now, Searle's behavior when he followed this rule of driving on the left-hand side of the road is in accordance with a different rule. Drive with your steering wheel near the center of the road. British automobiles are often built with steering wheels on the other side than they are in America, as you can see in this photo right here. And so Searle's behavior when he was correctly following the rule of drive on the left-hand side of the road was in accordance with the rule, drive with your steering wheel near the center of the road. But according to Searle, that second one was not the rule he followed, right? Even though his behavior was in accordance with the rule, he was following the rule of drive on the left-hand side of the road. That's the rule that he followed because that was the semantic content that he was using to guide his behavior. He was not using the semantic content of drive with your steering wheel near the center of the road. He could have, but that's not the one he used. He gives a second example. He mentions that when his daughters were learning how to drive, he and his wife sent them to the Oakland driving school. And there they learned a rule for parallel parking. And here was the rule the Oakland driving school taught you, because a part of the California driver's exam to get your license is to parallel park. A lot of parallel parking in California. And here's the rule the Oakland driving school taught Searle's daughters in order to correctly parallel park. Maneuver your car toward the curb with the steering wheel in the extreme right position until your front wheels are even with the rear wheels with the car in front of you. Then turn the steering wheel all the way to the extreme left position. And Searle said found that really interesting when his daughters told them the rule that they were trained on in order to parallel park. Because he said, that's really interesting. Because he said, actually, Searle says, I don't follow any rule at all. Okay. I just try to get my car as close to the curb as possible without bashing into the car in front of me or behind me. Now, look, I mean, for all Searle knows, maybe his behavior when he parallel parks on his way is in accord with the Oakland Driving School's rule. He may well be doing that, but he's not following that rule because the semantics of that rule is playing no part in guiding his behavior. He's not following that rule. So Searle's point here is that a human brain's understanding of the semantic content of the rule determines which rule, if any, a human brain is following. That's how the human brain uses rules. That's how human beings follow rules. But you know what Searle thinks about this. Digital computers following rules, programs to process information, they can't do this. They are purely syntactic engines with no capacity to grasp semantic contents. You'll recall Searle's Chinese room argument against strong AI and the computer model of the human mind. So there's no unitary sense in which a human brains and digital computer programs follow rules in the same fashion. We human beings follow rules because we follow our understanding of the semantic content of the rules. That would determine which rules we follow. Computers can't do that. The way they follow rules to process information is purely syntactic. So whatever we can learn about studying computer processing information, it won't be how human brains work. So what do you think? Is Searle right? Does Searle again have a serious problem to raise against, in this case, not just the strong AI or the computer model of the human mind, but of the methodology of cognitivism in the attempt to try to understand cognition in terms of information processing and computations on that information? Now, Searle concludes this chapter with an analogy on page 56 for the flawed methodology of cognitive science. And here's his analogy. So just consider, contrary to fact, suppose no one understood how clocks work. Suppose that was beyond current human understanding. Suppose there were lots of clocks around and we could carefully measure their behavior, their keeping time. But nobody could build a clock, and intervening into them tended to destroy them. Yet we really wanted to understand how clocks work, okay? So a group of scientists say, let's investigate how clocks work by studying something we can build that behaves similarly. Hourglasses. And these scientists try to convince us and try to get us to give money for their research. By studying how hourglasses keep time, we'll learn about how clocks keep time. Now, Searle says he hopes you see the silliness of the reasoning would be for studying clocks in this imagined scenario. According to Searle, that would be a really, really stupid approach to try to understand how clocks work. But now substitute human brain for clocks and substitute a digital computer for hourglass. And Searle asks, isn't the reasoning equally silly? Here's how the argument would go, right? There's the argument for clocks. Suppose no one understood how brains work. Well, we're kind of in that position. Suppose there were lots of them around and we could carefully measure the behaviors they produced in human bodies, but nobody could build a brain and intervening into them tended to destroy them. Yet we really wanted to understand how brains work. So a group of scientists say, let's investigate how brains work by studying something we can build that behaves similarly. Computers. By studying how computers work, we'll learn about how brains work. And Searle says, isn't that argument just as silly as that same argument as it pertained to clocks? Searle's answer to this is, by studying how computers work, we'll learn how brain works. No, we will not. How brains work, for example, how they follow rules by understanding the semantic content of the rules is fundamentally different than how computers work. Now, we'll learn no more, Searle insists, about how brains work to produce human behavior by studying computers than we'd learn about how clocks work to keep time by studying how hourglasses do it. To learn about how brains work, Searle insists, we must study brains. There is no substitute for just simply to bridge this gap between folk psychology and neuroscience. The only solution is do more neuroscience. Are you convinced by Searle's criticisms of cognitivism and the computer model and the way that computers process information and the way that computers compute information? Are you convinced that Searle's right, that we're not going to learn anything about how the brain works by studying that? Because what we're going to do for the rest of this course is start looking at brains. Now, obviously, this is not a neuroscience course. You can take that from me if you want, okay? This is a course in philosophy, so we're going to look at some aspects of neuroscience that are most relevant for the philosophy's mind-body problem. But that's where we're going in the last few weeks of the course. I'm going to start presenting you some details about what we now know about how the brain works, and I think you're going to be surprised at how much we do. Okay, so for our return to class on next Monday, okay, bring your questions from either or both of these recorded lectures with you to class, and we'll start by answering your questions about what I covered on both parts of this recorded lecture. Then I'll begin Bickle's whirlwind tour of all of neuroscience in 50 minutes, and introduce you to a little basic neuroanatomy and to methods in neuroscience. Just kind of give you the very basics of the way that the fundamental components of the brain work. So for Monday, what I'd like for you to do before you come to class on Monday, watch these slides as you already have, read in the Churchland book, chapter 5, section 4, and begin browsing the first two sections of chapter 7 of Churchland's book entitled Neuroscience. And I'm going to welcome you to learning some of the things we now know about how the brain works. Okay, with that, I will close part 2 of this recorded lecture for Friday, April 4th while I'm away. I will stop sharing my slides somewhere. There we go. And I will end the recording and get these posted to the course Canvas site. See ya.